Here we have the photography of Lee Friedlander. Lee Friedlander, American photographer, been shooting since the 60s, still photographing, still out there making artwork. Now, one of the interesting things about Friedlander is he seems to contradict everything about making a good photograph. Rather than simplifying his pictures and narrowing it down to some essential elements, he seems to jam as much as he possibly can into his frame, leading to photographs like this. Now, when you first look at this, it almost seems like visual anarchy. But the more you look at his work, the more you start to see there is an order. It's a complicated order, but he definitely is putting things together in his picture, really kind of exploring what photography is capable of. For instance, this picture, it's kind of divided into three sections. The left section, the right, and then the middle. The middle section is actually a mirror. I think it's the rearview mirror on his pickup truck. So you're actually looking in front and behind Friedlander at the same time because of the mirror in the picture here. Little things happen like the garbage truck there and that little square and this little man walking through. These seem kind of random at first, but as you look at more and more of his work, you realize it isn't. He's waiting for these kind of lineups to happen. Also, you'll notice in that rearview mirror in the middle of the frame, there's half a person in there. Kind of hard to see, but there's a person on the left side. That's actually Friedlander. A lot of times Friedlander will include himself in his picture frame. Friedlander goes to Paris. And of course, if you're in Paris, you have to photograph the Eiffel Tower, right? But not exactly your typical snapshot of the Eiffel Tower. Here he is still, a mile away or so, and he's including all these other elements in the photograph. Now, one of the things about deep depth of field is that it tends to flatten the image. Since everything is equally sharp, it gives the impression that everything is at an equal distance. And he takes full advantage of that in this picture here. For instance, notice the Eiffel Tower next to the world's biggest street sign. I mean, look at that sign, that triangle here, that pyramid shape, very much like the shape of the Eiffel Tower, is just as big as the Eiffel Tower. Now, of course, we know that that sign is much closer to us, but when you first look at this, it really looks like the Eiffel Tower and that sign are the same size. On the other hand, on top of this traffic control box here is the world's smallest human. Look at that. I mean, he's like 6 inches tall, standing on top of that box on the curb there. Now again, after you look at this, you realize this man is actually far away across the street. But because of the way he's lined these things up, combined with the deep depth of field, it creates this flattening of the picture frame. He just keeps throwing up stuff in front of our face. Here's a couple of buildings, and yet there's these objects blocking our full view of them. But he's not so interested in the buildings as how all of the different items in this picture fit together. How there is a real strong vertical line through the middle of the frame, top to bottom, and then a more broken horizontal set of lines across the middle here, kind of forming a cross in the middle of this frame. It's funny too, that small building in the foreground on the left is blocking our view of that house behind it, but this building has a couple windows. So we can actually see through this building to this person sitting on this bench. I mean, it's like another photograph within the photograph. Then in this empty spot on the right side here, we see this Shriner zooming by on his motorcycle with an American flag. The flag pops up a lot in Friedlander's pictures. Talk more about that in a minute here. Friedlander loved reflections. He loves combining all these different layers and using mirrors and glass, storefronts to create these reflections and combine things. Rather than trying to get rid of the reflections, he uses those as part of his picture. Lots of layering going on here. You have what's going on inside this soda shop. The soda fountain attendant on the left and the kid, again, holding an American flag on the right. You have what's in the window itself, the neon ice cream sign and the Coke and cheeseburger, also those pop bottles in the foreground. And then everything else is a reflection. All of these store signs you see here are actually reflections from what's behind Friedlander across the street. And then people milling about on the street here. Interesting how this menu is almost like a vest on top of the chest of the soda fountain attendant there. Now, photographers are influenced by other photographers. Friedlander, although he has a style all his own, has definitely been influenced by previous photographers, in particular Robert Frank. Robert Frank, very big figure in the history of photography. He worked on a project in the 1950s, which he ended up calling The Americans, where he bought a used car, traveled across the United States, and photographed what he saw. As a Swiss person, he was looking at America with an outsider's eyes, and it became a very influential book of photography. One of the themes in The Americans is the idea of conformity. This was in the 1950s when it was very much the emphasis was to follow what your leaders and businesses told you to do. Don't rock the boat. And there's a picture in The Americans of a man walking down the street with this big neon arrow pointing down the street. It doesn't say why you should go that way, but the guy below it is following that arrow, and it's his commentary on the conformism of the 1950s. Well, now it's the 1960s. The counterculture is coming up. People are starting to question authority. And here we see Friedlander's version of that picture, his update of it. We see these arrows pointing a certain direction, and a couple of people are going that way, but someone's going the opposite way. And then the businessman here, he can't make up his mind. Here's this question mark over his head, almost like a thought balloon in a comic. What should I do? Now, deep depth of field is important for Friedlander in almost all of his photographs. He uses this to combine all of the different elements into his complicated compositions. Here he is at a thrift store, and he's shooting through the window. And besides what's inside the thrift store, the bedroom set, the lamps, the items in the foreground there, we also get reflections of what's behind him. That big street light, it looks like a church, another building. And the way these things meld together, it's almost like the street light is just another lamp inside the building. This streak of light through here, like a bolt of lightning, is actually, when you look at it, fluorescent lights that are inside the ceiling of that storefront. So you really get an interesting mix of inside and outside. Times Square in New York, even back in the 60s, a very crowded place, but lots of signs fighting for your attention. Now, Friedlander did a whole series of photographs of monuments, of different memorials to different people and events. Now, a monument, when you think about it, is meant to confer importance onto something, someone or something. But here, Father Duffy, who, I forget his exact story, but is some kind of hero in World War I, his monument here is being overwhelmed by the surrounding graphics, the Coca-Cola sign, the hot tickets booth, which is back behind him here. I've always enjoyed this photo. This picture is like 90% reflection. The storefront that he's photographing here is actually empty. It's an empty store. There's no business in there. Lights are off. Like 90% of what you see in this picture is reflection. The factory behind him, cars on the street, this person, and then in the middle, this dark, mysterious silhouette. Who could that be? Well, actually, it's Friedlander. That's Friedlander himself popping into his picture. Now, a lot of times when Friedlander took these photographs, if he was in the frame, he would actually slide the camera down, so after framing it up, so that it wouldn't be obvious he's holding a camera up to his face. Now, besides his silhouette, there's a bright square in his shoulder here. And what we see in that bright square, we see another silhouette of someone there. Now, who could that be? Well, actually, it's Friedlander again. in the back of this store, there's a big mirror, and the mirror is reflecting Friedlander. So Friedlander is actually popping into this picture twice. Shadows too, besides reflections, he would also use shadows as part of his compositions here. And oh, poor Friedlander, his head and legs are here, but he's lost his body. But that's okay. In this picture here, he has turned himself into John Kennedy. His head's missing, and he's put Kennedy's head on top of himself. He's going down the street. He sees this frame shop. And rather than just hanging the frames at right angles, straight as you would on a wall, the owner of the shop decided to hang them at these odd angles, create some interesting graphics and perspective, try to catch the eye of people going by. So Friedlander sees this, and he uses the frames to reframe himself within his own picture frame. Notice here, here's his camera. So how he's like slid the camera to the side, and again, the mysterious Friedlander. We can only see a little bit of his face here. And again, you can see how he slid the camera down, and this trophy blocking our view of him, keeping us from seeing him clearly. I also like to think of this as maybe he's giving himself first prize. Here, Friedlander, look out, man on the telephone. Friedlander is lurking in this cigarette machine back here. Photographs inevitably become kind of a time capsule. This picture is from the early 1960s, and that is a cigarette machine, something that's been outlawed for decades since it made it easy for minors to get cigarettes. But hiding in the machine, we see Friedlander, a shadow across his face, and oh, poor Friedlander, his head is shrunk. Look, it's on top of his body here, which is twice as big as his head. This one is kind of half creepy, half funny. Here he is with this shadow projected onto the back of this person who has no idea that about Friedlander taking pictures behind her. And this one actually has somewhat of a shallow depth of field. Aside from knowing it's a city, his main interest is the way his shadow gets projected, not only onto this person's back, but how the fur collar kind of makes him look like he's got a buzz haircut. And the American flag again. Now, in the Americans, Frank used the flag as an ironic symbol. Rather than simply being about patriotism, he put it in spots where it seemed kind of odd or not particularly glorious. And Friedlander's doing the same here. Here, this patriotic grocer has his flag out in the window, but it's being crowded out by these canned vegetables on each side. It's interesting how the grates of this vent kind of line up with the stripes of the flag. So a formal element there, and then this single foot pushing itself into the frame. And the American flag again, but not only is it right next to what looks like some kind of sanitation trash truck there, but right next to it, fairy tales for adults, also lies. And finally, we see Friedlander clearly. He's at some kind of cheesy show down on State Avenue, as it turned out. This was, not take that back, that was Wabash Avenue here in Chicago. You can actually see the L back here. And Friedlander, we finally see him clearly, looking kind of disheveled. Probably didn't sleep too well last night. And maybe the ultimate comment on photography, photos 4 for a quarter. So, as you can see, although it's good to try to simplify your pictures, just have the elements you want, you can also play Friedlander's game. See how much you can jam into the frame and still make sense out of it. And a lot of this does depend on using a deep depth of field and bring all of these different elements together.